This is a 2021 Ford F-150. That's just so you know what kind of truck it is. But what I'm going to do, since it did not include a bed liner, I'm going to do the bed liner myself. And I've done this before. I did it on my previous truck. But when I did it on my previous truck, I prepped everything and then I just used the spray-in bed liner. This time I'm going to use a roll-on bed liner because I think using different spray cans and then putting it on, it kind of had discoloration or blotches where it wasn't uniform. So hopefully when I do it with the roller this time, it'll look more uniform. And so what I'm going to do as far as prepping, there are some portions on the tailgate, so I'm going to remove this plastic piece here so that I can prep this as well. Remove the plastic edging on the top portion of it. And then I'm going to have to remove this piece on both sides, remove the LED lights, the LED light button, at least pull the power distribution out so that I can get around it. Or I mean, I could just tape around it. I just don't like taping around things. If I can just pull it off and then do what needs to be done, I'll remove these pieces for the clevises that you can get, and then I'll remove those two plastic oval pieces in the front corner, and then I will start sanding. And just gotta sand it enough to scuff it up so that the bed liner has something to adhere to. If I put it straight on this, it'll start peeling off and coming off really easy. So just need to do a good sanding. Don't need to get down to the primer or the metal. Really don't want to get down to the metal. So I'll sand all that up. I won't have to remove these because the top is pretty much covered and it'd be pointless to do anything on this edge. But here in the front, I'm not going to do this top portion here because when I put my tonneau cover on, I want to make sure that it's got a good seal. If I put the bed liner on this, then I run the risk of the seal that's on the tonneau cover not being able to seal properly, and then I'll get a bunch of leakage through this. So I'm just going to leave this top portion undone. The bolts that hold the bed down, I'm just going to go ahead and put the bed liner on those as well. I use this hand sander. I won't be able to get everywhere with it, so I'll have to do some hand sanding as well, but I'll use this. And then what I got is this Herculiner truck bed liner. Basically comes, well, I'll just open the box here. Application instructions, regular cheap paintbrush, and you got 2 rollers, and you get 1 gallon of bed liner. Now, a lot of times when people buy paint or similar items, the first thing you want to do is shake it up, but they give you a nice little warning on the top not to shake it up. This should be more than enough to cover the entire bed of the truck. When I bought this, I thought it was a little expensive, but if you compare it to how many cans of spray you would have to buy and having to deal with the lack of uniform color, I guess it's not too bad. Trying to justify the cost by including these items, then these things are really cheap. As far as 1 gallon of bed liner, that's a lot. I don't know how many cans, I can figure it out, how many spray cans would compare to this 1 gallon. But what I'm really hoping for is that it will come out much more uniform than it did the last time I did this using the roll-on type. And cost of this kit was $89. Yeah, $89. As I said earlier, when I got the truck, it didn't have a bed liner. And if I had purchased the truck and it already had the bed liner done, they would have charged me $499 for it. Since it didn't have it, if I wanted it, they would have charged me $599 for the bed liner. So that's the main reason why I'm doing this myself. This is the truck bed after completing the second coat. I did remove the majority of the painter's tape right after putting the second coat on because it makes the tape so much easier to remove when the bed liner is still wet. Otherwise, if you wait until it's completely dry to avoid pulling or leaving residue, you would have to use an X-Acto or something along the edge of the tape. Otherwise, you're just going to pull this bed liner up on the edges. And I think I missed a couple spots, and you can kind of see where right there I didn't quite get all the tape, so the residue from the tape is on there. And then I also stretched out the bed liner, so it kind of pretty elastic like, so it pulled it and then kind of went back. I haven't removed this tape yet just because it's in a bad spot to remove without messing up the bed liner along the edges, so I'm going to wait until it's completely dry before I remove that. I can see where there's a big difference between the spray-on liner and the roll-on liner. The roll-on liner is definitely a lot more thicker, and I think it's also more durable, because I did have a spot where I had a big chunk that I didn't see, and then after it dried I noticed it and I wanted to remove it before I put the second coat on. So I went and tried to cut it with an X-Acto knife, and it was pretty tough. So this Herculiner I think will be pretty good. Some lessons that I've learned from doing this is make sure all your sanding is done, because you don't want to start and find a spot that you missed, such as a shiny spot, and then you'll have to touch it up, because if you've already poured your liner and you have to do some more prep work, not only will you possibly get paint dust all over, you're also going to cause your liner to dry up some. So make sure you get everything. I did have a few little spots. I noticed when I went back to the liner that I had already poured in the pan already starting to dry up some. And you definitely want to make sure that you only pour enough for what you know you're going to do, because you do have to constantly stir. The Herculiner that's in the can, it's a little more difficult when you got it in your pan ready to lay it down, but you got to keep this stuff moving, otherwise it coagulates and you end up with these chunky things all over the place. Some other things, especially on the front of the bed, it's kind of flat but not really, and then also the bottom of your bed as well. When you use the roller, you end up getting some lines, but what I've learned is that you want to try to avoid just doing straight lines. You want to kind of go all over the place so that you don't end up with these long lines on everything. This is a 5.5 foot bed, but it's kind of hard to do it fast enough to not get where you have overlap. The only way I think you can get around this is if you had a wider roller, but a wider roller is probably going to be a lot more complicated to get between all the ridges on the bed. And in fact, the roller that it came with was kind of a little too big. If it was like an inch shorter, it probably would have worked a little bit better in getting in between each of the ridges on the bed. I did completely cover all the bed bolts, all 6 of them, because I know from past experience these are going to be the first things that are going to get scuffed up. And I did sand them up a little bit to get the bed liner to adhere a little better, but I know as soon as I start putting stuff in the bed, the bolts or the heads of the bolts are going to be the first ones to get scuffed up. You definitely want to do a good job of getting all your edges that you know are going to be difficult to get with the roller, and you definitely don't want to brush on as if you're painting. you want to dab. And what I've found is that using rather than the ends when you're dabbing, it's easier to use the side of the brush to do your dabbing because it looks more natural, similar to rolling it on. When you dab it, it doesn't quite, you have to use quite a bit to get it to come out looking decent. You definitely want to get all your edges. And also, before you start doing anything, make sure you clean it really well. And the box gives recommendations for wiping it down before you start putting the bed liner on. But I sprayed it out really good. I let it sit in the sun, checked it to make sure there was no water anywhere in the bed. And then what I did is I took some microfiber cloths, soaked them with alcohol, and then isopropyl alcohol 70%, and I just wiped down the entire bed before I started putting the bed liner on. Something else is the box comes with a green prep pad. Found that I didn't think, after seeing what it was doing, that it was going to be sufficient enough to get the bed liner to adhere. And you definitely shouldn't be going down into the paint because the paint itself is part of the bonding process with the bed liner. But I went to a 220 sandpaper and used that, and I could pretty much tell that it was basically scuffing up the clear coat down to the paint. I did it, the majority of it, by hand because it was really difficult to use a hand sander because there's just too many curves and everything. And what you end up finding is that trying to maneuver it around, you end up going down to metal, trying to get one spot, only to find out that you just rub down to the metal with the sander. So sandpaper worked a whole lot better for me, and that's in fact what I did the first time I did a bed liner, was use sandpaper and not the green Scotch pad. 2 rollers is sufficient enough. If you know you're going to take a break or whatever, you can just put the roller inside of a baggie and remove as much air as possible from the bag. And that's what I did here. And I actually let it sit for about 4 hours, and the roller was perfectly fine. The brush didn't fare so well, so luckily I had additional brushes that I could use. I did also have these foam brushes. They're good for dabbing. Another thing to watch out for is make sure you're only pouring enough of the liner into your pan. You could, if you had some left over, put it back into the can. And then also, when you're using, so say that the pan is full of bed liner, is don't constantly take up your paint in one spot because as the rest of the paint sits around in the pan, dries up some, and then you end up, at some point, you've been doing it this way the whole time in the center or whatever, and then you decide to use the sides to get your roller wet with the bed liner. What you end up doing is collecting up a lot of chunks, and then you'll notice a change in the texture when you go to use the roller on your bed liner. So make sure you're moving around your pan when you're picking up the bed liner on the roller. It took me a total of 5 days to complete this, only because even though I have a canopy covering my bed, if you do have a canopy, it makes it a whole lot easier, especially if you're doing this out in the sun. The canopy help with that. But I guess if you decide you want to do this, you probably need to make sure you got 4 or 5 days that you can do this without having to use your truck. The canopy also helped with dust. Even if you do get some of that on your first coat, it's not too bad, because if you see it, you can probably brush it out. But if it's there, I don't think it's that big of a deal, especially if you know you're going to be putting that second coat on. But if it's completely covered, you definitely need to get it out before you start coating it. I did do the truck bed first, and in retrospect, I probably should have started from the front of the bed and worked my way back, but I really wanted to see what it was going to look like. It may have only taken me 4 days if I had started towards the front of the bed and worked my way back, but the tailgate itself came out pretty good. But I delayed working on the rest of it probably half a day or more, only because I wanted to make sure it was completely dry, because I didn't want to damage it while I was attempting to work on the rest of it. And it worked out. The other thing is, I could have removed the tailgate. I wouldn't say that difficult to remove. The tailgate does weigh about 97 pounds. There's only one harness, so in my case I would have to disconnect it from up underneath the bed and then run it through and make sure it's disconnected, and then I would have to remove this bolt right here, and then when you're ready to actually take it off, you remove these cables on both sides, and then you have to rotate it to 40 degrees to get one side out, and then you have to rotate it to 80 degrees to get it the rest of the way out and lift it off. It would have been easier to work on the actual bed had the tailgate been removed, but I left it on because it was kind of convenient that it does have steps off the tailgate, make it easier to get in and out. The other thing that made this take a little bit longer is the fact that this is North Carolina, been over 90 the whole time that I've been working on this, and also the humidity has been way up, so the humidity didn't help in drying this between coats and after the coats. I did have a fan sitting on the tailgate blowing inside. Don't know whether it actually helped dry it or not, but it all worked out. The only thing left to do is put all the pieces back on, the clevises, the LED lights, the push button, take the tape off the power box here, put those screws back in, put the tie downs back on, all 4 of those in the corners, and that will be pretty much it. It will be done. Might have to do some touch-ups. I do see some spots where it's a little bit thicker than others, but I really don't think there's much I can do about that. This is everything that you'll need to get the job done. Putting a roll-on bed liner in your truck bed. You'll need your Herculiner or whatever you choose to use. Gloves, a microfiber cloth or a clean cloth that you can use. I use this for cleanup along with the alcohol. Just basically soak the rag with the alcohol to wipe everything down. The application instructions say to use xylene, acetone, or MEF solution for prepping your truck bed. I use the alcohol because I've used it before and I know it works. And I don't know how much different it's going to be than any of those other 3 that I named. I do have some additional brushes. I do have masking tape. This is just my opinion, but removing as much as you can is better than using tape. And I could have removed the plastic top rails to make it a little bit easier, but I did tape those. No matter what, you're gonna have to tape your edges, and if you have a power distribution box, you'll have to tape around that unless you completely remove it. That's everything you need. Now, as far as anything else, I mean, I can see where these items can be used on regardless of what kind of truck you have. The only tools that I really need was a flat tip, a T30 bit, a 5/16 socket, an X-Acto knife, the drill, and I have this old moving blanket. Since the majority of the time you end up having to sit or lay on the bed to put the liner on, I use the blanket because sitting on this bed for long periods of time can start to hurt a little bit, so the blanket helped with that. Specifically for the 2021 F-150, the T30 bit pretty much was used for most of the components, and the only thing that I used this 5/16 socket for was to remove the tail lights that gave me access to the LEDs and the push button for the LEDs that is in the truck bed. I think the major difference between using the roll-on bed liner versus a spray-on bed liner is that this has rubber particles in it. When you stir it up, you'll see the rubber particles floating around, and you'll feel them at the bottom as you're stirring it. And I think where this is going to be better than a spray-on is that the can's not going to have the rubber particles in it as this does. And I think that's what makes the roll-on type more durable compared to the spray-on type. And I can see a big difference between doing this with a roll versus the paint can. It's definitely thicker. It's definitely gonna be better. This is very easy to mix in the can with just a regular stir stick. You don't need to use a drill with an attachment on it to mix it, but what you do have to do is make sure that you're constantly mixing it in order to suspend the rubber particles that are in it. In order to get a good liner, it's got to be mixed well, and you can do it easily with just a stir stick. Truck is now completely done. Got all the hardware back in. Didn't have any extra pieces. Came out pretty good. It's a little tacky still, but it started getting windy, so I had to take my overhead cover down because I didn't want to come out and find it laying on top of the truck that I just worked on. Overall, I think it came out pretty good. You can kind of see some overlap lines. Those will go away after a little bit of time, so there's a couple glossy spots that I'll have to touch up at some point, and I'll do that soon rather than later, because one thing I've learned is it's better to do it all at once, and if you start touching it up or a little bit of time goes by, it really stands out and definitely looks like patchwork. So probably tomorrow come back out here and touch up a couple spots that look glossy and don't have the plastic particles in it. There's so like right down there, you can see where it's kind of glossy. And along the bottom there's some glossy spots. A couple of other ones right next to the power box right there. There's a little glossy spot, and that's where it was sticking out, so I didn't get enough on there, so I'll have to touch that up. Well, also has some blue tape that flipped over on me and was sitting in the bed liner, so it's kind of integrated, so I'll have to touch that up. I did use an X-Acto to clean it up as much as I could, because I didn't want to just put the bed liner over it. Probably just peel right off. Overall, I think it came out really well, and I'm pretty sure it'll do its job. I'm gonna hold off as long as I can before I put the tailgate up, because as soon as I put it up, this portion of the tailgate is going to sit right against this rubber piece. You go back to the early part of the video, there were some clear vinyl pieces that were right here. And I think what the purpose was to prevent the tailgate from from sticking to this rubber. So I'm afraid if I put it up right now, that rubber is going to stick right here. So I'm gonna leave it down as long as I can. These were the clear vinyl pieces that were on here, and now that it's got a rough texture, it's gonna be a little difficult to put these on. So I may have to come up with some other way to, well, hopefully it just doesn't adhere to these little rubber bump stops. Please like, comment, or subscribe. Thanks again.